Sounds like a bit of a lull in the pinging of people joining. So let's make a start. Welcome to the third in our current series of webinars, where today we're discussing the topic of speed limit setting on rural roads and the impact it has on safety, but also the perception of safety. So in a moment, I'd like to introduce Duncan Knox from Surrey County Council, who will be setting out the story of speed limit setting on rural roads in Surrey, the methods previously used to determine speed limits, and what this current project's about. I'll then set out the findings from phase 1 of an evaluation study, which has been funded by the Road Safety Trust. And its aim is to understand the impact on speeds, casualties, and perceptions of risk of different speed limits on rural roads in Surrey. We'll then hold a discussion taking questions from you, so please use the chat function to pose those questions. If you start your message with the word question, it makes it a lot easier to come back to them at the end. So please add in those questions as we go along. It may trigger conversation with other participants and generate more questions. As ever, the webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on our website in a few days' time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Duncan.
Thank you, Tanya, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming. So if we move on to the next slide, if that's okay. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and rationale to the project and give an overview of Surrey County Council's speed limit policy that we've used and applied on this project, and the method that we've used to review our speed limits in rural areas. And as part of that, I'll give some examples of some of the locations where the speed limit is being changed. And of course, that leads on to the need for evaluation of the project, and Tanya will pick up there. So next slide, please. So I probably don't need to persuade the people attending here today that vehicle speeds are high. Speeds are a bad thing. We all know that. Not only is it bad for road safety, it's also thought to deter more walking and cycling and push scooting and horse riding in rural areas particularly as well. And one big issue actually in Surrey is noise pollution. Lots of complaints about high speed vehicles and the noise that they bring. Of course, safer speeds is one of the main tenets of the safe systems approach to road safety. So I think this is, we're focusing on this more and more. Part of the what caused the project to come into being was the fact that rural speed limits do not make sense to local people and elected members, and probably not to me either in many respects, in that you may have some main roads in rural areas where we've actually reduced the speed limits because they were the ones with collision hotspots and road safety issues, but then you turn off the now 40-mile-an-hour main road onto a single track country lane where the national speed limit applied, which is 60. So there's no real common sense to that. And of course, that speed limit is just inappropriate for most of those roads. No one's travelling at those speeds, so it's irrelevant and obsolete in many respects. New cars are going to be fitted with intelligent speed assist, and I think speed limits and sensible speed limits could be even more important. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So following inspection of speed limit maps across Surrey, we noticed that not by design, but by chance, that the speed limits in the bottom right, the southeast of Surrey, had all been reduced over time, over a couple of decades, from 60 mile an hour down to typically 40 and a few 50s. But that had not happened to the same extent in the south and southwest of Surrey, just because there were different political priorities and local committees of members spending money on highways on different projects. It had happened sporadically in different places as different local communities had lobbied and petitioned. But in many cases, a lot of those requests have been turned down because changing a speed limit on a single road where they were asking for it wasn't thought to make a great deal of difference, and therefore it hadn't been prioritised compared to other schemes for, pedestrian crossings or what have you. But doing it like that, incrementally, bit by bit, it's more expensive in the long run, and it also results in an inconsistent application of speed limits across the county. So we had the idea of asking for some money from our road safety camera partnership called Drive Smart, and we were lucky to get £100,000 to spend on reviewing some of our rural speed limits in a strategic, proactive way, rather than just simply reactive to local people asking for changes. And we don't think that'll be enough to do as much as we want. So we're going to supplement that with some of our own county council money as well. So I would probably want to say as well that the speed limit reductions on the road are unlikely to reduce speeds very much in any one location. It's not going to make a massive difference, because we know that speed choice is often determined by other things. However, I do think it will make a small difference at lots of places, which overall adds up to a big difference, if you see what I'm saying. So rather than spending £100,000 on, say, one signalised crossing at one location, spending that amount of money on a project that covers a large area makes a small difference, will make a big difference overall, if that makes sense. A lot of people are very sensitive about signage clutter, understandably, and I think I'd sympathise with that. But we're trying to be careful about the signage that we use, especially with a large part of the area being in the Surrey Hills area of outstanding natural beauty. So we're trying to use wooden posts where we can, and where possible also co-locating repeater signs on existing signposts and street furniture, rather than adding new posts wherever possible. But I would acknowledge that there will be more signs. But one thing to bear in mind is that the latest speed limit signing requirements are less prescriptive than they used to be. So you don't have to have them every 350 metres on either side of the road. It's not set in stone anymore. And I think that's helpful, because there are some stretches where no one's going to be going too fast on this stretch because it's just not physically possible. So you perhaps might not bother with a repeater on that bit, whereas the bit around the corner where it's longer and straighter, you might want to put in a speed limit repeater. So it gives you a bit more flexibility. So I'll just touch on our speed limit policy. So it's fairly straightforward in that our policy allows us to introduce a new lower speed limit if the existing mean average speeds are below the thresholds listed there. And you'll probably recognise those thresholds as being 10% plus 2, so they're fairly familiar. So if the mean speed is below that, then you can introduce that new lower speed limit without the need for supporting engineering measures. And we weren't looking to put in engineering measures on this. This was all about putting new lower speed limits using signs alone, this project, for the most part. So the method that we used was, first of all, we weren't going to do the whole of Surrey in one go. So we tried to define a study area that had convenient boundaries, and by which I mean the area was bounded by probably major roads and the border of Surrey, so that the roads that we were looking at would terminate at a main road. And that would reduce the amount of terminal signs that we would need as you're going into the area. And the next step was to do lots and lots of pneumatic tube surveys, huge amount. And we had to drive the routes and try and find suitable locations. And I've been drive virtually on Google Street View, but also physically in person on occasion to try and find suitable locations where we could attach the pneumatic tube surveys. I think it's worth saying as well, you could probably triage it somewhat using telematics speed data, which is available. But I think for this project, we needed to just do the pneumatic speed surveys just to be sure what the actual speeds were at those spot speed locations. So rather than completely covering the whole area with lots of surveys on one stretch of road, if the stretch of road doesn't really change very much, then you probably choose the stretch where you think the fastest speeds are going to be, because that's going to be the limit at which you're going to take into account the data to set the new limit. And then once you've got all the speed data in, you then kind of plot it on a map where what the speeds are, to see what new speed limit is going to be viable in relation to the existing speeds. And this is where you have to probably get a little bit creative and careful in terms of using common sense to choose natural thresholds in the look and the feel of roads to say, well, I think this stretch is viable as a 30 because the speed data makes sense there, and actually it terminates at this T-junction, so that's where the 30 starts, or it terminates at this stretch where it goes down to a single track road with passing places, where after which it becomes a 20, where there's a natural break point or a bend or something like that. So the next step we took was to present our new speed limit map to key stakeholders, parish councils and local members first, before we took it to the wider public, just to get what their views were and understanding of it and support. And actually it's an extremely popular project, and the area that we're covering now, people are knocking on our door to say, can we be included, can we next? And I guess the answer to that is yes, if this goes well. So in Surrey, there are various local committees, 11 in total, and the area we were covering encompassed 3 local committees who decide on highway matters. So we presented the outline proposals to them for their approval to proceed, which we obtained. And then we commissioned detailed design, and then the next step is to do the formal legal consultation advertisement of the legal speed limit orders, which will be coming to in the coming months. So this is just a very brief look at what the highway network looks like with the level of speed surveys. So we did 90 in total, and you can see how we've positioned a lot of the speed surveys. The colours on the map relate to different existing speed limits. So red is 30, light blue is 40, and dark green is 60. So we were focusing, as you can see, on the roads that were 60 miles an hour national speed limit. And we've put all those speed surveys in there. So there were far more roads than we expected for where a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit was found to be viable. So I've listed them there, but I think the next slides will show you what I mean if we move straight on. So just to show you, first of all, the speed limits in the southeast of Surrey are shown by this map here. So as I was saying before, a lot of the roads are already 40 miles an hour, light blue, and there's hardly any dark green left, with the dark green being national speed limit. So if we move to the next slide, this shows the map of Surrey to the south and southwest, and you can see there's a lot more dark green on the narrow country lanes. So that's where we focused our initial phase of work. So this is the map of existing speed limits, and I think you can just about see a pink highlighter pen showing the extent of our initial review. So we're not covering the whole area, it's just the middle south of Surrey. And if we move to the next slide, you can see that's what we're changing the speed limits to. And we were quite surprised that there was quite a lot of 20s in there, a lot more than we expected. But then when you look at them, it makes sense. So if we move to the next slide. So that is currently a 60-mile-an-hour national speed limit road. Well, it doesn't make sense at all, does it? So, perhaps this should have been changed years ago anyway. But it's not just that road, it's actually quite a number of the roads leading into that village as well. This is Friday Street, and again, it's just a narrow country lane. But there's a lot of walking and outdoor pursuit activity in this area, so it doesn't make sense for it to be 60, and no one's going 60 anyway. They're going 24 or less, the mean average. This is the centre of a village called Peaslake. It's currently 30 miles an hour. For the most part, we weren't looking to change the existing 30 mile per hour or any of the lower speed limits that were already lower than 60. But because the country lanes leading to this village were going to be 20 in many cases, it made sense to make the village at 20 as well. And then you can start to see a typical country lane where a 20 wasn't viable, slightly wider, there's room for 2 vehicles to pass, but it's currently national speed limit, so that one's going down to 30. And again, that's another example of a B road. It's currently 60, no one's going 60, they're going 35 or less, and so that one's going to be reduced to 30. And this stretch here is a slightly less bendy stretch, and it's got the centre line markings, and that was viable for a 40 limit based on the existing speeds. So we're really excited about the project, but we need to know, will it work? Will it make much difference? We're investing this money and it's really popular, but so what? Will it work? So we need to look at the collisions and casualties, and I think, you know, obviously it'll take a while to bed in, but we can do a more immediate comparison of speeds before and after implementation. And my guess is there's not going to be a huge reduction in average speeds, but I'm hoping, and what I think will happen is that the 85th percentile speeds will come down a little bit more significantly, and that'll be really good news if that's the case. But what's going to be great as well is that the public attitudes and understanding of the speed limits is going to be really interesting, and that's why we're really pleased to commission Agilicis to complete that evaluation for us, and we're benefiting from a grant from the Road Safety Trust to do that. So that slide seems to be out of step, but there we go. So the next steps, we're going to be implementing a new lower speed limits this summer and autumn, and then Agilicis have completed phase 1 before analysis and be doing a phase 2 evaluation after that. And following that area of Surrey being tackled first, I think it's so popular that we'll be moving on to doing the rest of the south of Surrey and probably the north of Surrey, but most of the speed limits in the north of Surrey bordering London are lower than the national speed limit already anyway. I think I need to mention my colleagues Matt Smith and Chris Agent, who've led on this work for us on top of their usual workload and done a great job so far. So thank you for listening, and I'll hand over to Tanya.
Great, thank you. And I can see loads of really great questions coming through. So if you wanted to have a look at those, Duncan, and prepare some responses ready for at the end. Right. So as Duncan just said, we have phase 1, which is a piece of work that we've been involved in. As Duncan's just explained, Surrey's quite unusual in that the east of the county has seen speed limit reductions on rural roads over a number of years. So before any further limits were changed, it provided us with an opportunity to explore the data related to those existing limits and compare the east of the county with the west. So it gave us that opportunity to understand the effects of those previous changes in limit on those areas, looking at speed compliance and casualty rates in the two areas. It also allowed us, as Duncan's just said, to understand public attitudes to rural speed limits, and also to see if and how perceptions of risk and compliance differ in the two halves of the county. So our primary aim was really to understand the relationships between risk, speed limit changes and compliance on rural roads. And as Duncan's just said, we submitted a Road Safety Trust proposal, and we're really grateful for them supporting this work, which began in March 21. So what did we do? Well, we undertook speed analysis on 2 different sources of data. Surrey County Council provided hundreds of outputs from permanent and temporary surveys from across the county over time. And as many of you will know, data from automatic traffic counters, or spot speeds as we refer to them in the research, is typically very detailed and can provide vehicle by vehicle analysis by time of day, vehicle class, and really offer comprehensive speed profiles. And as Duncan says, that's what he's been using for looking at the new limits. Now, whilst there was a wealth of data provided, we really only used it for reference purposes, because actually, even though we had many hundreds of spot speed measurements, it wasn't sufficient for us to carry out a comprehensive analysis of vehicle speeds across the whole county. So instead, we used an alternative data source, which was a combination of telematics data from Teltrack Navman, combined with a national speed limit, which is produced by Insight Warehouse and supplied by Basemap. So this speed data is updated annually, with speed limits updated quarterly. And we've got raw vehicle data, which is coded to the road network, link by link, journey by journey, and it results in around 14 billion link journeys per year. So in the research, it refers to link speed, and it's the time over distance calculation which is used to provide figures for average speed and 85th percentile speeds. To ensure the accuracy of the speed limit mapping that we were using, Surrey County Council provided information on when any of the speed limit changes occurred. So the speed data sources allowed us to compare speed limits and speeds on roads in Surrey to detect if there are any significant differences in speeds and compliance in the existing rural limits. And in addition to that, we used Stats 19 data for reported collisions, together with model traffic flow, to assess both collision density and collision rates on our selected rural roads. As we've already touched upon, in addition to the use of this quantitative data, we also wanted to understand how local residents perceive risk and compliance. So we created a survey of predominantly closed questions using existing questions from the DFT question bank where appropriate. This was disseminated by Surrey County Council using its social media channels, and I'll come on to some of the results of that later. The local authority also identified interest groups and stakeholders for interviews, ensuring representation across the county. And some virtual interviews were held to understand how different types of road users feel about safety and compliance on rural roads. We also conducted a light touch literature review to understand evidence relating to speed limit credibility and risk perception, compliance, and attitudes to speed limit changes, etc. So we set ourselves 4 objectives for these research, and you can read them here in detail. So the first 2 are to determine if the collision rate and mean vehicle speed are lower on rural roads with lower speed limits than on higher speed limit roads. And then the second 2 objectives are to understand the perceptions of those living in areas with lower speed limits, i.e. the east, and if they differ from those living elsewhere in the county, and whether this influences attitudes towards compliance with speed limits. So what did we analyse? Well, the roads in blue here on this map are what we included in our rural road network. So they are, we included the roads if they had a 40, 50 or 60 mile an hour speed limit, which hadn't changed in the last 5 years. And it was in a predominantly rural area, which is defined as being within 50 metres of a rural LOSA, which means a settlement of under 10,000 people. So this gave us nearly 3,000 individual sections of road, covering 573 kilometres and over 2 billion vehicle kilometres of traffic each year. Just over half of these roads are subject to a 40 mile an hour limit, echoing what Duncan's shown about those limits that had changed earlier. And a third still subject to 60 mile an hour. Nearly all of these roads were single carriageway, 92%, with 7% as dual carriageway. Now, one thing I want to say before I proceed, this analysis only focuses on our sample of roads in Surrey. We don't know how typical this network is or whether these results would be similar in other counties. So that's just a little bit of a disclaimer before we proceed. So collision analysis was conducted using the most recent 5-year period of 2015 to 2019. We matched collisions to the road network through proximity and recorded road number and class. There was an annual average of 261 collisions, with 63 of these involving one casualty who was killed or seriously injured each year. Just over half were on 40 mile an hour roads, but then as we've just seen, this comprised the majority of the road network. 65 were on 50 mile an hour roads and 16 matched to 60 mile an hour roads. So this chart here is looking at collision density per 100 kilometre of road, and the highest number of collisions per 100 kilometre were on 50 mile an hour roads and the fewest on 60 mile an hour. This chart shows the distribution of collision density across all road sections. I really like these charts. The wider the area of the chart, the longer the amount of road that has had that number of collisions per 100 kilometre. What it means is these wide bases show that a large amount of the road network in any speed limit didn't observe any collisions between 2015 and 2019, although to a lesser extent for roads with 50 mile an hour speed limits because that base is narrower. It also shows that a smaller proportion of 60 mile an hour roads have higher collision densities compared to 50 mile an hour, which is why that one's squatter. So this is where Craig may need to bail me out, but so a Bayesian Poisson regression model was constructed to determine the significance of these differences in collision densities. So 60 mile an hour speed limits were used as the baseline. I know this chart's quite faint, but that's why it's just got the one dot at 0. and sampled modelled coefficients were used to determine the relative difference between the expected 60-mile-an-hour roads collision densities and those of 40 and 50. So what we've got here are 2 points which show the average of the sampled coefficients, and the vertical lines are the 95% confidence intervals around these. So it shows that for 40-mile-an-hour speed limits have collision densities around 25% higher than the 60-mile-an-hour speed limits, whilst 50-mile-an-hour tend to have around double the collision density. And the confidence intervals here suggest that these differences are significant. So does this analysis mean that there's a causal link between speed limits and collision densities, and that actually what we're saying here is roads with higher speed limits are safer? No, absolutely not. What it does do is show that there are significant differences between these parts of the network. And so we undertook further analysis to explore the relationship between vehicle speeds and road risk. Differences in traffic levels were not analysed in those previous charts. So modelled vehicle traffic was taken from the telematics data sources and used to calculate collision risk rates, the number of collisions per billion vehicle kilometre travelled. What this chart suggests is that 40-mile-an-hour speed limits cover, as we know, would cover a large proportion of the roads, and also a large proportion of the roads that have a relatively low traffic levels. And actually, that's also true for the 60-mile-an-hour speed limits, although to a lesser extent. Meanwhile, the 50-mile-an-hour speed limits cover fewer low traffic segments and have a higher proportion of higher traffic segments, which is why that goes up more thinly, towards the top there. So analysing the combined collision rates per billion vehicle kilometre travelled for each speed limit separately found that 40-mile-an-hour roads in our sample had the highest collision rates, but this is due to having those lower traffic levels. However, when we tested those results were not actually statistically significant. So we know something interesting is going on with our sample, where roads with different speed limits are exhibiting different levels of road risk, and some of these differences are statistically significant. So we looked at actual speeds. Our speed data analysis used that telematics data so we could get as much coverage of the network as we could. It was also supplemented by an additional 775 traffic surveys, which are those spot speeds from Surrey. So we undertook analysis to compare the link and the spot speeds, and whilst the link speeds were slightly suppressed because they're measuring over a long stretch of road rather than one location, there was good correlation. So this chart shows that the average link speeds by speed limit, and shows that 40-mile-an-hour and 50-mile-an-hour roads have similar distributions of average speeds. But 60-mile-an-hour roads appear to have much lower speeds than the speed limit, with a large proportion between 25 and 35. And this pattern continues for both 85th percentile speeds and when spot speed data is analysed. And Duncan's already touched on this when he's gone out to look at what is going on those existing roads, 60 mile an hour. A lot of them were much lower than at 60. So to try to understand why driven speeds tend to be below the speed limit, we looked at a range of potential factors. We wondered if road width might influence selected speeds, with drivers choosing to drive faster on wider roads. However, actually we found there was little difference in road widths across the speed limits. We then looked at sinuosity, both the curvature of the road and the number of curves. More sinuous roads reduce visibility and require more concentration from the driver, which might lead to lower driving speeds. So these charts here show a comparison of average speeds with the sinuosity of road links, and there is a clear trend. The higher the sinuosity of the speed, the lower the average speeds. However, distribution of sinuosity was again similar across the network and different speed limits. So this again isn't what's reducing those speeds and those 60-mile-an-hour limits. Carriageway type, though, does appear to play a part. Undivided carriageways offer less protection, with dual carriageways commonly featuring barriers which separate vehicles from oncoming vehicles. So this might influence the way people drive and the speeds at which they choose to travel at. So this chart shows that average speeds tend to be considerably lower for single carriageway, the darker blue one, the second one along, compared to dual carriageways. And what we found earlier was a higher proportion of 50-mile-an-hour roads are dual carriageway when compared against the proportions for 40 and 60-mile-an-hour roads. So this suggests that the higher proportions of single carriageway roads could be partly responsible for the lower average speeds observed on the parts of the network that are 40 and 60 mile an hour. Again, this chart is quite pale, but so the data analysis showed that there is not a clear relationship between the posted speed limit and the speed of vehicles on 60-mile-an-hour roads, particularly. The 85th percentile speeds for both 40 and 50 are on average very close to the limit, but for 60 mile an hour, these values are closer to 40. So Craig did more modelling, and this was used to determine the relationship between average and 85th percentile speeds on rural roads for 4 different risk metrics. Collision density, which is the bottom one, which is the number of collisions per 100 kilometre of road. KSI collision density, which is the number of collisions per 100 kilometre, which involved at least one casualty who was killed or seriously injured. The risk rate, which is the number of collisions per billion vehicle kilometre travelled. And the KSI risk rate, again, the same thing, but for those more serious and fatal collisions. These models account for the differences in road carriageway type, put the teeth back in, and the coefficient sampled from the models show the expected effect on these risk metrics from an increase in speeds of 1 mile an hour. So this chart shows those modelled coefficients resulting from increases in average speed of 1 mile an hour, with the lines showing the 95% confidence intervals. So what's it showing us? Well, for an increase in average speeds of 1 mile an hour, it's expected to raise collision densities by 1.7% and KSI collisions by 2.3%. Likewise, not shown here, but in another chart in the report, is the 85th percentile speeds, which would be expected to raise by 2.4% and 2.9% for KSIs if we increased 1% by 1 mile an hour on 85th. So it shows that increasing speeds, particularly high-end speeds, lead to an increase in collisions. Now, when we're considering the traffic-based collision rates, the relationship between risk and speed becomes much more complicated. So modelling suggests that actually an increase in average speed of 1 mile an hour leads to an expected reduction in risk rates of 1.3%. However, KSI risk rates are expected to increase by 0.7%, and again the 85th percentile speeds increase with every 1 mile an hour. So what we think we're seeing here is that greater speed differentials at the high end is a really big contributor to elevated risk, and that higher speeds tend to result in more severe collisions. Now, that reduction on the total casualty rate is unexpected, and there could be a number of possible explanations for this result. It could be that some of the roads with these lower speeds, the complicated, some of those villages that Duncan showed earlier, are associated with junctions, complicated road sections where risk could be higher, a real mix of different road user, for example. It could also be that the roads that can sustain those higher speeds and flows have received greater investment in road safety engineering measures and may also receive more frequent maintenance. So we definitely don't have all of the answers from this analysis. So I'm going to move on to those other 2 objectives quickly now. So as I said, the survey was disseminated online through Surrey's County Council's social media channels. And the age distribution we received showed a slightly older audience, but we did receive nearly 2,000 responses from across the county. Likelihood to drive on rural roads decreased with speed limit increases, and this was more likely to occur if people were walking or cycling. So there was this kind of almost natural feeling against increases in rural road speed limits, that it was going to deter travel for a variety of different modes. It's quite disappointing to see that 1 in 4 residents could not correctly identify the national speed limit for cars, although I suppose flipping that with the fact that there are so many different speed limits in Surrey on rural roads, perhaps there is no such thing as a national speed limit there anymore. This was actually quite common amongst older residents as well as young drivers. When we did explain what the national default speed limit is, however, the vast majority said that exceeding the limit would be dangerous. When they were asked if they would comply with lower rural speed limits, the results again were very positive, although young drivers reported lower intentions of sticking to a reduced speed limit. Perceptions of other drivers are poor, however, with the majority thinking that other drivers would not obey lower limits. Coming back to our objectives, there was very little difference between the residents of East and West Surrey and their speed limit perceptions and attitudes. Now, it could be a result of changes in the East being implemented incrementally over a series of years, but also we know that people move around and the drivers and road users travel regularly between the different areas and just become accustomed to these different limits. Overall, the lower speed limits are generally well supported, and the public were understanding the risks of breaking the speed limit or travelling too fast for conditions. But the results did indicate that residents believe a speed limit reduction on its own will not automatically lead to compliance with the new limit. The final part was of data gathering was through interviews, which were conducted on Zoom and Microsoft Teams back in April 2021. Surrey provided us with a list of contact details of different interest groups, and I see Colin from MAG is on here today, who participated in this. So these were interest groups who are regularly contacted for consultation and research purposes. The interview questions were kept quite open because actually we had a range of people who were represented in these different road user groups. Motorcyclists, horse riders, and cyclists were interviewed. And the purpose was really to understand how local road users and residents feel about rural road safety and speed limits. Now, there were only 2 motorcyclists and 2 horse riders interviewed. And so, yeah, the sample here was quite small, but the idea was it was just getting a flavour of some of their views. When taken as a whole, however, most interviewees, regardless of user group, agreed that speed limit reductions are not enough on their own and need to be accompanied by additional enforcement, education, and awareness of road safety and responsibility when driving on rural roads. Engineering roads so they serve as effective and safe modes of travel for all types of road user was a priority expressed by the interviewees, helping to make these roads more inclusive. So whether or not it was the occasional horse rider or the enthusiast motorcyclist, understanding collective and personal safety and also respecting different types of road users was seen as much more important than blanket speed limit reductions. Interviewees believe that perception, behaviour and attitudes won't change without fully understanding the problem, and actually each road user group felt quite isolated by the other groups. So perhaps there is room for a more kind of inclusive and collaborative campaign aimed at improving road safety, where kind of looking at and supporting the speed limit reductions, which is looking at those shared responsibilities. Certainly something that we did find was perceptions of personal safety varied with experience, with the more experienced more comfortable with faster speed limits on rural roads. So overall, the analysis of the evidence relating to the selected rural roads demonstrated a clear relationship between travelled speed and the frequency of collisions, especially for the most serious collisions. But the complex nature of the road environment makes comparison between roads difficult, especially where blanket changes across an area have not been implemented. So reviewing data for other similar roads in other counties would perhaps deepen our understanding of these different relationships. It was very clear that there is an inconsistency between road types and the speed limit in place, and Duncan talked about that right at the beginning. Having 60 mph in some of those which are now going to be 20 just doesn't make sense. And actually we're involved in another piece of work to classify rural roads and understand function and form better. I think there's probably no such thing as a rural road, something which shares the same characteristic as all other rural roads. We're actually also working on a piece of work for the World Bank here, which is understanding the economic benefits of reducing speeds. And that does use some of the same methodologies as this research. So excuse the fact that there's lots of text on this slide. I'm sure Dan will be having kittens, but so read the report rather than read this in total. But what we have done is, looking at our objective, has identified and confirmed that higher speeds result in increases in collisions, and the public are generally supportive of lower speeds. And the research also notes that changing limits on their own may not necessarily achieve compliance. However, driven speeds on many rural roads are already much lower than the posted speed limit. These findings are in line with previous studies which show that average speed and speed variance are more important than the posted speed limit in determining safety. I think what it does also indicate is that further reductions in speed limits, they're not going to increase harm if new limits are selected in response to actual 85th and average speeds. So there'll be some roads where greater reductions in speed limit can be implemented compared to others. There is a phase 2 of the study which will occur after Duncan has implemented his reductions. And this is going to explore the effects of those reductions in different limits. We're going to revisit the public perception survey, and we will conduct speed limit analysis. It'll be too soon to do the collision data analysis. But I think what we will also do is understand the role of publicity, because these are not going to be able to be snuck in under the radar without people being aware of them. And obviously the role of enforcement comes into play. I did see somebody ask a question about other groups within the survey as well, and that's certainly something we're going to try and do. And in the interviews is capture the thoughts of other road user groups. So I was about to say you can access the report from the RSGB Knowledge Centre and the Road Safety Trust, but 2 colleagues have posted it in the chat, which is really useful for us. I was about to say, so any questions, but actually we've got dozens of them. So I'm going to scroll up to the top and we'll work our way through, Duncan, and see what comes out at the end. Okay, so question from Colin to begin with. What is the order of priority between consistency, noise, active travel and safety as the drivers for change?
I think the driver for change for us as county council officers was to improve road safety, but probably the main driver for change amongst local people and members is probably a catch-all word: nuisance of speeding vehicles where they live and the country lanes that they want to use, and that's noise and pollution and just making places less pleasant to be. So all of that together, I suppose, is the driver for change, without any one of them being a priority, depending on which stakeholder you are.
Great, thank you. Question from Jane. Deregulated is not meant to be 60 mile an hour, but drive according to the conditions with 60 mile an hour max for cars, 40 for HGVs, 50 for towing, etc. If we signpost a speed limit, are we saying that is the safe speed? So she's from the Highlands, and on some of our single track roads, forward visibility and topography probably means that 20 is the correct speed.
Sure. I think I'd probably turn that around a little bit in that, you know, by saying that everyone should be expected to drive to the conditions, that if you were to take that to its extreme, you would say, well, let's get rid of all speed limits and everyone should just choose the speed that they think is suitable for the road ahead of them. And we've discussed this quite in depth with police colleagues and other colleagues in the county council. And we've said, you know, yeah, I understand that people should always drive to the conditions and what they can see ahead of them, but there's no point having a speed limit if it's not going to mean anything on that particular road. And I think most people will choose a sensible speed, but there will be that 15–20% who are going higher than the 85th percentile who are being reckless. And it's those people I think we need to be, you know, clamping down on some more. And that's where this project I think will benefit the most. Great.
Dave says, are you worried that the rollout will have a detrimental effect on rural areas that currently have a lower limit in force?
No, and I'm not sure I completely understand that question.
Okay, maybe Dave can clarify.
Sorry, Dave.
Kendrick, what are the predicted accident savings with this approach?
I don't know, but we'll find out, I suppose, when we get the evaluation in, once we can do some more before and after. But we all know that, you know, in a general sense, a 1% reduction in average mean speeds results in 5% reduction in casualties. So we know that lower speeds are safer. So I think what we need to do is work out what the speeds will be after we've implemented the new lower speed limits. And I think the expectation is that risk will go down.
Yeah, which is what our findings, apart from that one peculiar result, definitely did show. Neil has asked, so just for clarity, the speed limit maps were set without any reference to collision or injury data. Your new limits, it's purely focusing on speed data, isn't it?
Correct. Yeah, it's basically looking at the average mean speeds on each stretch of road and setting a speed limit that's appropriate and is likely to be successful in being adhered to by the majority of people based on what most people are travelling at the moment.
Richard's asked, what was the reasoning justification behind the thresholds for reducing speed limits based on the surveyed mean speeds and exact thresholds?
Sure. So our speed limit policy is based on the DFT circular for setting local speed limits, and within that, there were formulas published in an annex that showed that if your existing speed was, let's say, 48 miles an hour, and you put in a 40 limit signed only, what was the likely new speed, mean speed likely to be, and it would give you a result using those formulas. So we used those formulas to set thresholds below which we knew that if we put in a new lower speed limit using signs only, that the new mean speed would be very close to the new speed limit, if that makes sense. So, and that actually happens, turns out to be pretty much 10% plus 2.
Great. We're getting into the practical elements now. Did you have to take on board extra staff resources and other funding, or were these already available or ring-fenced?
Well, we were looking to get funding from our road safety partnership, and we're also looking to get some, because this is a popular project within Surrey, we also get some more money from our decision makers, our county councillors. Staff resources, we tried, but I'm sure my team would tell you they would have liked to have had more staff resources. So it's pretty much a new project on top of what they were already doing, and I thank them for working hard on this and going the extra mile.
Great. Are the 20-mile-an-hour restrictions going to be zones or limits? And if the latter, do the police enforce?
They're going to be limits, and for the most part, these are roads where it's impossible to enforce because there's nowhere at the side of the road to stand. And that's why it's crucial to set speed limits that are going to be reasonable, which most people are adhering to anyway, because the mean speeds are close to it anyway, because the expectation is, and the only reason the police are happy to support this project. Well, I say support. When we consult with the police in Surrey, they usually have 3 responses. They either object, support, or tolerate, I think is the best word. So they didn't object to this, but they were happy to accept it. But the expectation is, and we had a discussion with them on this, is that we wouldn't expect them to have to enforce these because we'd be setting them with reference to our speed limit policy, which they do support, because we're setting speed limits that are reasonable, that the most people will be adhering to anyway, without the need to provide additional enforcement. But of course, we'll wait and see what effect that has.
And that kind of links to Alan's question. So he asks about what about education and enforcement? So what about the education element?
Yeah, well, I think we were going to be publicising these new speed limits, and there's a lot of interest and knowledge about the project already amongst the parish councils. Whether it's well known amongst the wider public yet, I don't know, but we'll be soon to be advertising the speed limit changes. And I think it's a good opportunity to, advise people on the negative impacts of speeding in rural areas and to try and get that message out there. So I think it's important to build support for the speed limits when we're implementing them with that kind of communications activity, and then they'll be more accepted by more of the drivers that are using those roads.
Great. And thinking about other modes, did you complete before and after pedestrian and cyclist counts?
No, we didn't. And yeah, maybe we should have. It's a very difficult thing to do when you're in the middle of a pandemic and all the kind of road user behaviour and volumes have changed. But it would be interesting to see whether it would support more people getting out walking and cycling. But I think it would be quite a hard evaluation to get robust data on to cover so many different roads and locations.
Great. We've got several questions from Colin. So yeah, why is there no, and probably most of them are for me actually. So why is there no breakdown of stats between different road user groups? So I may need Craig to kind of pop in some responses into the chat here as well. But the idea was to really understand rates and the relationship between speed and casualty rates, collision rates, as opposed to understand exactly what was going on with any particular road user group. So we probably could do it, although saying that the numbers of casualties, thankfully, over that kind of area were not very large, and therefore breaking down by a particular group would be difficult. Yeah, and I think that probably answers the next one with looking at different road user groups and injury caused to other road users that were not exceeding limits. We just didn't really have the data for that. Any effort put into getting more survey responses from motorcyclists? So they went, yes, you're right, there were not a great deal of motorcyclists who completed the survey itself. It went out through Surrey's normal channels, which is a range of road user groups. I will say that, yeah, there were probably more older residents who were engaged than perhaps some of the younger ones. I think this is probably quite common for local authority surveys. And we were obviously interested in those who were resident in survey. So whilst we could have come out to you, Colin, at MAG and got you to disseminate it, we were really only interested in those who were resident. So, but yeah, perhaps we can engage with you when we do round 2. Using collision density as opposed to injury density. Well, the idea that we obviously looked at severity with the KSIs, so we did look at both of those. What else have we got here? Was driver perception considered as a factor? Drivers are more likely to moderate speeds when passing houses, pedestrian schools than open fields. This is a problem in Suffolk where compliance with 30 on the outskirts of villages or within dispersed settlements is poor. Yes. I know well, Steve, because I live in Suffolk. So yes, yeah, driver perception. Have you got any thoughts on that? And obviously, you know your roads much better than I do in terms of the data that you've seen for the new limits.
Yeah, certainly. So for me, what we had to do when we were choosing the new speed limits is try and choose sensible endpoints and start and end points for the new lower speed limits. So when we were looking at certain stretches, we were thinking, okay, we need a length of around 600 meters. National guidance is that should be the minimum length over which a speed limit changes, although that's not completely set in stone. And I think there are some slightly shorter lengths, but not too much shorter, just because that coincided with a natural threshold or break point in the look and the feel of the road. But in some cases where that was not possible, we have invested in more substantial village gateway features to try and make the look and the feel of the road and the threshold into the new speed limit much more obvious where there's perhaps an open field or it's not quite as clear. So I think you're right, Steve, that's an important part of trying to apply some common sense to try and getting the speed limits to be as effective as possible.
Great, thank you. Let me just see, we're drawing to a close here, but we've got a couple more questions popping through, and Craig is thankfully answering the one on different road user groups, so I hope that helps, Colin. I'm not going to read out the details there. Neil, given your results, could one draw the conclusion that the problems of rural roads are more related to excessive illegal behaviour by a small minority? Do speed limits have any impact on that?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think the problems that people experience are probably that smaller minority who are going a little bit too fast than everyone would prefer, but they're not, arguably, they're not doing anything illegal because they're well within the speed limit. So, by bringing the speed limit down to something that's sensible, that most people are already obeying and being compliant with, it's making those higher, faster speeds illegal for the first time, and perhaps that will persuade a few of them to reduce voluntarily. But yes, there will always be people who will ignore speed limits, but I think it'll be a lot easier to try and tackle that and persuade people to slow down if they're clearly breaking the law.
Yeah, and it certainly looked from our data that the speed differential was a real driving factor in those higher severity collisions. So I think just to offer up, this has been really useful because both Alan and Colin have volunteered to help us with disseminating the survey locally in Surrey when we get round to phase 2. So that's perfect, and I think a great spot to end on. So just before we do disappear, I want to highlight the fact that next week Dan is hosting another one on speed, but this time looking at the other end at 20-mile-an-hour limits. So please do register for that one, 2 o'clock next Tuesday. And I would just like to end by thanking you all very much for participating. Thank you, Duncan, for the great presentation and for working with us on this. And yes, you can find the report via that blog and on the website. Thank you all very much.
Likewise, Tanya. Thanks everyone for listening. Cheers.